Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Makes me want to read it right away. It's a really very amazing, interesting story. He was up in the B-17 bomber crew, which is crazy enough, and he was shot down. He was in a POW camp, and he spent the last, I guess, he suffered with post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm not sure how long, I don't know if the whole time or not, but he's currently works with people down in Mohegan Lake area of the state, helping returning veterans. And I guess his book is about the subtitle is My Private War, Liberated Body, Captive Mind of World War II POW's Journey. And the journey is all about what's happened to him since all these events I just said. I'll just read you one sentence here of what one reviewer wrote. It says, Norman Bussell describes with passion, grace, and humor the entire arc of the life forever changed by fighting for his country. His induction into the United States Army Air Corps at 19, the travails of training to become a member of a B-17 bomber crew, the minute details of a disastrous final mission over Berlin, internment in Camp Stalag Luft 4, and the years of struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder following his release. So here's Norman Bussell to tell us about his book.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Joe, and I want to thank you all for coming, and anyone who brought food and is eating, please feel free to go ahead, because a POW likes nothing better than to hear the sound of crunching food and someone is enjoying their meal. This book began as a memoir to sort of reprise what happened to me and my crew, and we lost 4 members on our crew during World War II. And after I had written it, I realized that it was a book about PTSD. And so the book is really although it's written about something that took place 65 years ago, it's really as current as today's next newscast, because PTSD is on everyone's lips, and it's affecting not only veterans, but the guys that are coming back now from Iraq and from Afghanistan. And it's very difficult to get them to come in for treatment, because most of them are in denial. And it's sad they don't come in sooner, because the demons have gotten them in their clutches by the time they come in a year and a half or 2 years later, and it just makes it more difficult for counselors to help them to improve. What I want to do is just read a smattering from several different portions of my book to give you a flavor of each succeeding event that took place from when we began our last mission until I was liberated. Anyone who fought in a war can think of many times when death was cheated because of the slightest change in plans, in routines, in circumstances. Such an incident took place as we began our mission to Berlin. As we flew over the English Channel, little Joe, our ball turret gunner, came into the radio room and sat on my chest chute, which was just in back of my chair. I could understand why he did it. It was a hell of a lot softer than the hard, cold floor of the plane. But I turned and said, little Joe, don't sit on my chute. What if I have to use it today? I know Joe tossed the chute across the radio room, and it landed next to the door leading to the bomb bay. It won't hurt the damn chute to sit on it, he said. As it turned out, if little Joe hadn't tossed my chute across the room, it would have been consumed by flames, because the fire started in the exact spot where my chute had been lying, and I would have had nothing to bail out with. I never got to thank little Joe for saving my life. A few minutes later, this sweet little kid from Brooklyn was dead. He was just 19 years old. As we flew deeper into Germany, the sky began to fill with black puffs of smoke as flak shells exploded all around us. Any notion that these bursts were innocuous was quickly dispelled with the occasional ping of shrapnel fragments bursting through the aluminum skin of the plane. It sounded like gravel being thrown against a tin roof. Then Bill reported incoming fighters, and Daddy began to call each gunner on the intercom to check if he was firing at the attacking ME-109s. My pilot was nicknamed Daddy because he was the oldest on our crew. Ed was 28 years old. I was shooting my overhead gun in the radio room when Daddy called for me to report, and I got out 2 words, "Yes, I," when a burst of flak, which must have been right on top of us, blew a huge hole just above the desk where I'd been sitting. Fragments splattered over my body, knocking me down and ripping off my throat mic. When I abruptly stopped talking, Daddy knew that I was hit, and I heard him yell, "Norm's hit. Someone from the waist get in there and help him." I could feel the blood running down my face, my leg, my rib cage, but I didn't really believe that I was gravely wounded, so I snapped my throat mic back on, and as quickly as I could, I said, "I'm okay, guys. Repeat, I'm okay. Stay with your guns. I'm getting back on mine." I had just started firing at another fighter when our plane was rocked again, and I was thrown against the side of the ship. As I stood up, I realized that I was no longer getting any oxygen, and then I saw the flames behind my chair, and the plane's skin began dripping molten aluminum. It was surreal to watch the aluminum skin, the metal that appeared to surround us so protectively, suddenly drip, drip, drip like soldering lead. My plane was melting before my eyes. Obviously, our oxygen lines were burning because the fire was so intense. I tried to use the intercom, but it was dead. I never heard an order to bail out. Flying at 28,000 feet without oxygen can do weird things to your mind. I seemed to be moving in slow motion. With the plane burning around me, I didn't feel rushed or afraid, nor did I sense any danger. In fact, my impaired brain even flirted with the idea that the flames would go out and we would turn around and fly back to England. After all, our engines were still intact, still emitting their low, powerful, steady tone. I opened the door to the waist to see if I could help anyone there, and I was confronted by a solid wall of flame. I tried to peer beyond it, but I could see nothing. As I slammed the door shut, I heard explosions inside the radio room and felt powder burns on my face as a raging fire caused my ammo to cook off. The blasting of the 50 caliber shells jerked my ammo belt violently, and it danced like a large metallic snake, writhing in the flames, contorted with anguish. I still didn't think about bailing out. The plane was flying along on a smooth, level course. I realized that the intercom was out, but I never heard the alarm bell, and I thought Daddy was still controlling the plane. What I didn't know was the plane was set on automatic pilot, and I was flying with four dead buddies as my sole companions. I decided to head for the cockpit to see if anyone there needed help. First, I hooked on my chest chute, not realizing that the left clip was not completely locked. As I opened the forward door, I saw that the bombs had been salvoed. The empty racks gave silent testimony that our deadly cargo had been dumped on Berlin, and the bomb bay doors were wide open. I looked down, and far below I could see thick layers of clouds. As I stood in the doorway, I turned and looked through the huge hole in the left side of the ship and saw that the flames had engulfed the entire wing. The wings, of course, are where the plane's fuel is stored. By now, my clothing was on fire, and I knew I'd never make it to the cockpit. I stepped out onto the catwalk in the bomb bay, and for a brief instant, I remembered my famous last words. I'll never bail out of this plane. I'll go down with it first. And then I jumped. I began to count to 10, delaying pulling my ripcord so the force of the air would make my flying suit stop burning. I was falling on my back, and I could see the plane moving away. I had reached the count of 7 when the ship veered wildly out of control and then exploded into a million burning pieces. I had been 7 seconds away from eternity. I was falling through the sky, feet first now, and I watched the fragments of my B-17 as they disappeared from view. It was hard to believe that the Mississippi Lady was no more. Her graceful wings torn asunder, her throbbing, powerful engines silent forever, violated by the long, probing anti-aircraft guns that sent flak tearing through her fuselage, ripping her apart. When I jerked the pull cord on my chute, the unbuckled left side flew up and hit me under the chin, knocking me out. When I came to, I was surrounded by a thick white mist. There was no feeling of movement, and I figured I was dead. I pondered the horrible boredom of going through eternity enveloped in this moist white fluff. As I began to pray, I recoiled in surprise at what I first believed to be the booming voice of someone else, and then I realized that the shouting was coming from my own mouth. The sudden change from being on a burning plane with the engines roaring as it tore through the sky to the ethereal quiet of this new white world in which I now floated was so shocking, so breathtaking that I was completely frozen. And then my face began to sting, where I had suffered powder burns from my exploding ammo. I touched my face and it hurt like hell. I didn't have to be a scientist to realize that the dead feel no pain. And when I burst out into the open and saw the land beneath me, I remembered that at our briefing that morning, we were told to expect cumulus clouds at 14,000 feet over the target. I was floating at 14,000 feet over Berlin, but I was alive. For the past several days, I'd been having nightmares about being shot down and captured by the Germans. In keeping with my plan for survival, I reached up and pulled my dog tags from my neck. The newly issued tags with the telltale H pressed into them. The H was the United States Armed Services designation for Hebrew, which meant that I was Jewish. I felt that disclosing my religion to the Nazis would be suicidal, so I threw the tags as far away as I could. Wounded and defenseless, I drifted toward the ground, toward a welcoming committee of hate-filled civilians who were hell-bent on killing me. And then suddenly I was no longer moving and floating toward the earth. The earth was flying up to meet me, and I slammed into it with such a crushing impact, I felt as if I'd been swallowed by it. Momentarily unconscious, I was quickly brought back to reality by many hands jerking me to my feet. Had I not been supported, I would have been unable to stand. I had landed on my right knee where I had taken a piece of shrapnel. I was bleeding from wounds in my arm, body, and face, which was also burning from the explosion of shells in my gun. Looking around, I realized that I had landed in the backyard of a large house. I was surrounded by 3 women and 2 men, armed with garden hose and rakes, and they began beating me about the head and back with the wooden handles. They were angrily shouting at me in German, but their words came out in torrents, and with my meager knowledge of the language, I was unable to understand very little of what they said. And then one of the men broke away, ran over to a tool shed, and returned with a length of rope, which he tied tightly around my neck. He threw the loose end of the rope over a tree limb, and then they all took hold and began to haul away at it. Frantically grasping the rope just above the noose with both hands, I was standing on tiptoe when I heard the sound of a motorcycle and saw a soldier roar into the yard, jump off his bike, and yell, "9, 9," and he rushed over and snatched the rope from their hands. My captors were still bent on hanging me, however, and began to argue with the soldier loudly. The soldier spoke slowly and more distinctly than my would-be executioners, and I was able to understand when he told them that first he would have to search me. And if he found a gun, they could hang me as a spy. Otherwise, he'd have to take me in for interrogation. He quickly determined that I was unarmed, and then, seating me behind him on the motorcycle, he gunned the machine and spirited me away. Stalag-Luft 4, Kriegsgefangenenlager der Luftwaffe, prisoner of war camp of the Air Force, a German POW camp for captured U.S. Air Force non-coms, was located just outside the town of Groß-Teichau in East Prussia, near the Baltic Sea. It was opened in May 1944. My engineer Red and I were the first contingent of 65 men to arrive at the camp. It wasn't long before we shortened the German word for POW, Kriegsgefangenen, to Kriegi, which is what we began to call ourselves. Our daily diet consisted of half a slice of black bread, which contained sawdust as an ingredient, along with a cup of ersatz coffee or tea at morning and night. The only redeeming factor about the coffee and tea was the warm water it was made with. Otherwise, neither tasted like any beverage I had ever swallowed before. What were we waiting for? A fresh shipment of sawdust so they could make more bread? At noon, we were given either dehydrated cabbage soup, which was flavorless and caused severe diarrhea, or a barley soup that was afloat with bugs. At first, we carefully extracted the bugs, and then someone came forth with wisdom that bugs contain protein, which was rare in our diet, and we stopped fishing them out. On luckier days, we received a boiled potato, and once in a great while, the soup contained a few grams of stringy mystery meat, which came from probably a horse that had keeled over and died. The dried cabbage came in large bags, which had to be reconstituted with water by boiling. Was that so hard to come by? Was it taking a long time to breed more bugs for the barley? I stayed at this camp for almost a year, and our rations never increased by so much as a crumb. My weight when I was captured was 165 pounds. When I was liberated, I barely made 100. My wounds were untreated. Of all the combat veterans who served in the United States military, POWs are most likely to be silent about their experience, because their experiences accurately reflect who we are today. And we don't want to share with you who we are today. Who we are today makes us uncomfortable. POWs are different from the rest of society in ways that are so far removed from the norm that we're embarrassed to talk about them with anyone except other POWs. That's why in therapy, it's more effective for POWs to meet in group sessions with other POWs who can relate to their idiosyncrasies. The phobias that resulted from our confinement are too deeply personal to discuss with friends, family, or often even professionals. It could take months for a psychologist, even one specializing in anxiety disorders, to draw out a POW. Some years ago, a psychologist rolled his chair near to mine and raised his voice to drive home a point. I quietly told him, "Back off. You're too close. You make me feel boxed in, and never, ever raise your voice to a POW. If you do, you're looking for trouble. He recently recalled my words of advice and thanked me for teaching him something important about POWs, which was that POWs lead lives of controlled rage. This is a rage that we have disciplined ourselves to suppress, but smolders still in constant risk of exploding. A rage that began with our capture. We raged at our condition. We raged at our enemy for his inhumanity. We raged that we were so helpless, so hopeless, that we were starving, that we were cold, that our wounds and illnesses went untreated, that we were constantly scratching at sores and lice, and sometimes we even raged at God for allowing us to be captured in the first place. I would be more than happy to take any questions.
Other survivors from your crew, are they alive today?
Only my waist gunner is alive. Wade will be, in November, he will be 94 years old. He lost an eye on our last mission, but he's a tough old bird and he's still hanging in there. And next week, he has invited me to speak at a library in Oxford, Pennsylvania, which is where he was born and reared and spent his whole life. And I'm going down to see him and to speak at his library.
God bless.
Why do you say the incidence of PSD for Iraq and Afghan veterans is higher than World War II veterans?
That it's higher? It's higher because this is a different war than we were ever fought before. In past wars, guys got to, after a while in combat, you got to take some R&R and you got to go to the rear lines for a week. If I was fortunate enough to come back from a mission, I got a clean bed, good food. I could go to the PX and buy a beer. I wasn't worried that an explosion was going to take place in the next minute on my base. These guys never have a moment respite. When they set foot into a Humvee, it could explode. Even on the base, they're not safe. I have a guy that I met who was head of an Iraq veteran organization. He had 2 Purple Hearts. One when he got into a Humvee, and the second when he was on the base, walking on the base, and Iraq. He came in and he got wounded again. The pressure is constantly on these guys. They're doing 2, 3 tours. Also, they're sent over for a year, and at the end of that year, a lot of times they say, well, you're going to have to stay another 3 months. Here's a guy that's been waiting with this one end date in mind that he's going back home, and suddenly you're telling me he's got to spend another 3 months there. And it's just horrendous the shape they're coming back in. A lot of them are in denial, a lot of them are on drugs and alcohol. And I've been there, anything to kill the pain. Had drugs been available, I was an alcoholic for 30 years. Had drugs been available back then, I probably would have tried that too. You'll try anything to help ease the pain and transport yourself away from these feelings. But of course, nothing helps. The next morning, the albatross is still sitting at the end of your bed. And what does work? Well, let me say this. There is no cure for PTSD. The blogosphere is full of suggestions as ridiculous as marijuana or ecstasy. You're going to give somebody who is already hooked on something else to get hooked on? It doesn't work. But if veterans will come in for counseling, improvement is a given. They're going to improve. And vast improvement is commonplace. But you got to get them to come in, and they know how to do that. And I know recently I was lecturing at West Point, and after the lecture, one of the cadets came over and she said that her brother was just back about 2 months from Iraq, and he sequestered himself in the house. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He was going through this agony that she could see was so obvious. And he wouldn't go for help. And I said, all I can suggest is you have to try to talk him into coming in. He's not going to improve on his own. It's going to get worse. So that's the greatest problem, getting these kids to come in today. And the ones that do come in, we're doing some marvelous things for them.
Was it very difficult for you to write the book? Did it bring back a lot of painful feelings and memories, and how did you get through that?
It was indeed. It was very tough. And I just, I hadn't finished the book. It was in my computer for years, and my granddaughter, who was a writer, came over one weekend and said, Grandpa, let me see what you have on your book. And I said, I really don't have much. And I cranked up my computer. My computer, you can imagine the age of it, because my spell check doesn't have email or internet on it. So she cranked up my computer and looked at it. She said, Grandpa, you have a book here? She said, I wish you would finish it. She says, I'll get you an agent. She said, this is a part of your life that I know nothing about. And that sentence got to me, and I said, I'll finish it for you. And I did. And it was a bloodletting. And after I had completed it, and my agent had looked at it, and my editor looked at it, and my editor called and said, I know this is probably someplace you don't want to go, but you're going to have to. If you're going to have a memoir, it has to be complete. How do your children feel? How do they react to your PTSD? And I said, I never asked, and she said no. So my sons live on opposite coasts, and they didn't know that I was going to call. And they both had the same reaction. The main thing that bothered us was your hair trigger temper. We were afraid of you. And one recalled the day that they had been out playing baseball and walked through the living room, and one of them dropped a baseball bat on the floor. And he said, it really didn't make that much noise, but you were climbing the wall, you just became so incensed. And that's exaggerated startle response, and that's what all guys who have PTSD have. And you don't go through combat without some level of PTSD. You're going to bring home some emotional baggage. It may be at this level, it may be higher, or it may be all the way at the top. And especially the guys who lose friends over there, it is very, very difficult. That to me is one of the worst stressors that I have is survivor guilt. I've asked myself over the years, and I still do to this day, why them and not me? I mean, they were better guys. This one was more religious. This one was more generous. He had so many more attributes than I. But that's God's choice, and you can't argue with it. But I still don't stop asking. And this past April 29th was 65 years since that event. And it was a solemn day for me, as every April 29th is.
When you came home, you had a bunch of physical ailments too. When did you think of, or did you go to a psychologist and psychiatrist? That time was called shell shock, I guess. They didn't even use the term PTSD. But did you seek help soon afterwards?
I think what we called it is battle fatigue then. My father was in World War I, and that was shell shock. And now it's PTSD, and it's all the same thing. But no, they didn't have anything available for us then. This is like 1945. And a lot of guys were in denial, but I was in such excruciating pain that psychologically that I wasn't going to stand back and not try to get some help. So I went by the VA, and they said, we can help you, but you have to come in as an inpatient for 120 days. And then we can treat you as an outpatient. Well, I had a wife and an infant son by then, and I couldn't do that. And so, and they didn't have much to offer anyway. They didn't have the psychotropic drugs that they have today. They didn't understand POWs. There was nothing in the book, in the text for them to read about POWs, so they couldn't offer much.
at the POW camp, how long were you there, and you eventually liberated, or did they escape, or?
I was a POW I was captured on April 29th, 1944, and liberated April 29th, 1945. So April 29th is a good day and a bad day. And I'm not a very superstitious person, but I'm always wary of April 29th.
Was there any attempt to escape?
I escaped once when it was really done to do it, but I had no choice. We couldn't escape at our first camp because we were near the Baltic, and there was nowhere to go, and this was the worst winter in Europe in 100 years. And my clothes were in tatters because when I bailed out, I had a flying suit on. And a flying suit is like an electric blanket. It has wires in it, and really the cloth is thin. And the Germans that first interrogated me, it was out at the interrogation center, and I was probably one of the first Air Force POWs they'd seen. And they felt that wire, and they said, we found something here. And they did. They tore the wires completely out. And when they did, they tore cloth with it. And so I was like a rag man until about Thanksgiving, when the Salvation Army got us some clothing in. But we'll get back to your original question.
Escape and liberation.
Yeah.
Escape, yeah. Okay. It was toward the end of the war. I was liberated in April, so this must have been early in March. We were marching from from Nuremberg to Moosburg in Bavaria. And they put us in a wooded area one night and surrounded us with the German shepherds and the guards, and that's where we were going to sleep for the night. And it rained cats and dogs that night, and it just poured. And the next day when I got up, my feet had swelled in my shoes. Now, I had 3 buddies who'd been trying to get me to escape with them all along the route, and I said, it's crazy. You can hear the artillery. It's going to be, a couple of weeks or something before we liberated. And I wouldn't go with them. They wanted me to come because my German had gotten pretty good by then. And so the next morning I knew that I wasn't going to be able to walk, and I didn't know whether I'd be shot or bayoneted. And so they roused us out about 4:30 in the morning, and it was still dark. And I said, look, if you guys want to go, I'll go with you. The road was up high, and I said, let's just fall in this ditch just before you get to the road and lie there and pray that the column gets past us before daylight. And the column did pass us just before daybreak. And we took off across fields, and we'd stop at farmhouses, and I would tell farmers or their wives, whoever was there, that if they would give us something to eat, I'd leave them a note saying that when the Americans came in, that they treated us well, and to be sure and treat them well. Well, they didn't have that much to give us, but there's certainly more than we've been getting in POW camp. And we did well until we came to the huge Autobahn. And trucks and material, troops were going up and down the road. And I didn't want to cross that road. We came to a huge potato cellar just before the road, and there was a transom in the top. And I had somebody boost me up, and it was filled with raw potatoes. Well, we didn't mind eating raw potatoes. I said, we could stay in here. It would take a direct hit to explode this thing. It's so well covered with dirt. And they wanted to go through, so I wasn't going to stay alone. We crossed the road, and just as we got across the road, some kid on a bicycle saw us. And a few minutes later, the Hungarian SS picked us up. And we were to be court-martialed and probably shot. There were two Brits that they captured shortly after they got me there. And they were from the Great Escape, the camp where the Great Escape took place, and they told us about the guys getting shot there that had escaped. So, but fortunately, General Patton came to the rescue, and his troops, tanks, liberated us. And I didn't know until just a few years ago that there was a broadcast that they intercepted from the Germans that our final camp in Moosburg had all nationalities you could think of. There was this last camp where they got everybody together. And Hitler had sent out an order to kill the 12,000 Americans in that camp, only the Americans. And I was at a national meeting a few years ago, and the guy asked how many there were from Salt Lake, were from Lewisburg. And I said I was, and several other guys. And he said, "Do you owe me a cup of coffee?" And I said, "Why is that?" And he told us about Hitler sending this order out. And he said, "We intercepted the SS before they got to the camp and wiped them out." And I said, "You deserve more than a cup of coffee. I'll buy you a drink."
Do you believe we currently have the resources, even if not now committed, to help those who have PTSD?
Do we have the resources to help them?
Yeah, does the expertise in sufficient numbers exist?
We need more. We need more people. Yes, we have the expertise, but unfortunately, you can't get it from outside, from civilian psychologists. It's just not in there or know about it. But what's happened along the years, people from the VA who are very experienced have retired, and they haven't been replaced, and they didn't anticipate this huge influx coming in from Iraq and Afghanistan who are going to need help. There are going to be just so many. The VA is admitting that there are probably 300,000. It's far higher than that. I won't estimate, but it's far higher than that because you don't come through that kind of experience, as I said, without having some measure of PTSD.
Collateral damage.
And that's something else. When you think about a veteran with PTSD, you don't think about the collateral damage that's with his family, relationships. For every guy who has PTSD, what are there, maybe 8 or 10 people who are also going through the throes of agony with this guy because he's, you come home, you don't fit into the slot where you were before. That doesn't exist anymore. You have to form a new life. And you had all of these plans and all of these ideas, and all of a sudden no one understands you. They don't know where you've been. They don't know where you're coming from. You can't explain it. You don't want to. You want to internalize it. And if you explained it, they probably wouldn't understand. So it's it just goes so much farther than the veteran. And I've seen so many families that disrupted divorces and children are suffering and they don't know what's going on. And you take a kid that's 10 or 12 years old and his dad comes home and he's a different guy and he's irascible and he can fly in a fist of rage and they don't know how to handle this. And that's the sad result of it.
You said 4 people from your crew succumbed. How many survived? What was the total?
6. There were 10 on that crew. And I didn't know for years where my 4 crew members were buried. And every other year we go to England for our bomb group reunion, and we always have a ceremony at the Mattingly Cemetery, which is a American cemetery there. And so one year I was speaking, and the superintendent was arranging the microphone there, and I asked him, "How do I find out where my guys were buried?" He said, "Just follow me into my office and I'll crank up my computer and tell you." And in a minute he told me that one was sent back to the States, he was buried in Pittsburgh, and the other 3 were buried in Saint-Avold, France. And little Joe was buried in France. And there's a picture of me with my hand on his tombstone there because I told my wife Melanie, I said, the next time we go, I want to visit that cemetery in France. So the next time we went to England, we went over to France. And I know they're just dust and bones, but to me there was a communication. It was just a marble cross that I had my hand on, and yet I could feel my buddy there, and I got to finally thank him for saving my life.
Has your book helped some veterans to seek help or anything that you've heard that you know of? Or?
It has indeed, but I guess what hurts is, especially after I did a C-SPAN broadcast, I got so many emails and phone calls from survivors, widows, children. Usually the veteran had passed on, World War II veterans, and widows saying, gee, we had such a horrendous life. I just wish I had known this earlier. Maybe we could have had a better understanding if I understood what he was going through. And children would say that, we really never had a relationship with our father. And that is so sad, because the guys internalized it, they never spoke about it. And the kids, the widows didn't even know why the guys were so irascible.
Can you just give us a little background of your, post-World War II, where you were born, what did you do for
Sure.
work?
I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I went to the same high school that Elvis Presley went to, although he was much younger than I. And I didn't know Elvis. His aunt lived across the street from a food store that my father owned. But I was going to go into the Naval Air Force. I wanted to go to the Air Force, and my mom said she would sign the papers finally after much pestering. And my dad was in World War I, and he wasn't happy with it, but he said he would. And I went and I passed the exams from the Naval Air Corps and came running home with his paper, and my mom says, I'm sorry, you're probably going to hate me for the rest of your life, but I won't sign the paper. So I couldn't volunteer, and I went to work building B-25 planes at a factory in Memphis, Fisher Body. And then I was drafted, and as fate would have it, during the draft period, they send each incoming group to where they're needed. So you could be needed in the Air Force, in the Army, or wherever. And luckily they needed guys in the Air Force, so I did end up in the Air Force, and I got to be where I wanted. So from there I held several jobs, and it just didn't work out. I had this hair trigger temper, and I would not be able to really function the way I should, and I would leave on my own. I didn't get fired, but I just couldn't handle it. So I finally went to work for my dad, and of course that was, and I worked very hard for him, but he knew on some days that I would be less than 100%, and he didn't pester me about it. And then I had studied journalism at Memphis State University, and there was no opening in Memphis for journalists. So one day I read an ad in a trade paper, trade magazine, that they were looking for an editor. And it was a supermarket business publication. And I wasn't going to apply. I didn't have the guts to apply, and I told my mom about it, and she said, look, you do it. She said, what's it going to cost you a stamp? And so I did, and it evolved over time, and I was, several months later, I was brought to New York and interviewed the guy who was going to be my boss and my mentor and one of my best friends. And after he hired me and I went to work there, about 6 months later we were out to lunch together, and he told me that he had been a POW. He was shot down over the Pulaski oil fields, and he had been a POW in Hungary. So we lost George a couple of years ago, but he was a very dear friend. And then my wife, my future wife, was hired by my boss. I was out of town. I had an interview set up, and I said, I guess I have to cancel that interview. He said, no. He said, I'll interview for you. And I came back and to work on Monday after my trip, and he introduced me to this teeny bopper. He was 21 years old, and I was twice her age. I was 42. Any psychologist in the country would tell you that this is never going to work. And I think now there's a chance of us working. It's been 40 years. So I think we're going to hang in there. And then I went through some awful times working in New York, times that I couldn't let on to my colleagues that what I was going through, and some days were bad. And of course, there was help available on my health insurance. but I wasn't going to divulge that I had PTSD. And so I just suffered with it until we started our own business, and I was near the hospital where we work now. And I finally got some help there. And I've been seeing the same psychologist for over 20 years, and he and I are very good friends. In fact, he wrote the foreword to my book. I guess you shouldn't be friends with your psychologist, but we are. We're good buddies, and we hold sensitivity sessions in VA hospitals for personnel there, because I have some great fears now. You have a guy who shot 5 people at a mental health clinic recently. I know you read about it. And as we tell the hospital personnel that come in and see us, you don't know who's walking in that door. If you've had a bad day, internalize it and don't speak about it. Look at this guy coming in the door and think, this guy needs my help. I don't want to be abrupt with him. I don't want to in any way make him angry, because he's probably been through hell, and he probably has. And I just fear that one day something's going to happen in one of the VA hospitals. Now, at the hospital, it's quite a distance from us in the Bronx. When you go through there, before you go into the hospital, it's like going through the security in an airport. They go with this wand and all, and they really search you. I don't say that every hospital should have that, but I think that precaution has to be taken, plus sensitivity to the patients who come in.
Sorry, I came in late and I didn't hear all of your talk, so I apologize if you already answered this, but what do you think your attitude towards war has changed?
I guess my attitude hasn't changed. I was never in favor of a fight that we had no business starting, and I'm not. I guess maybe I should have bragging rights. World War II, I think, was the last war that we really should have been in, that we really had any reason to be in. And no, I wanted to get into that war, as every young man did. I mean, our country was attacked. But war in general, for the sake of war, there's untold suffering, and our country becomes the ugly Americans everywhere in the world, and we harm ourselves in so many ways, and losing our youth, and casualties within families. And we really have to think before we start picking up a gun and firing at someone else. We really do, and we're going to have to learn that, because apparently we aren't, at that mindset yet.
If everyone who serves in Iraq and Afghanistan is subject to IUDs, etc., are all service people eligible for VA benefits and eligible for help for PSD?
Yes. Yes, if they come in, they can get service. Now, there are certain services that they can't get until they get compensation. They have to pay a partial payment. But it's not that much, and the partial payment for medication is not that much. But if they come in, and they're going to certainly be detected with PTSD if they have it.
Even if they have an MOS that isn't a combat MOS?
Well, we just fought a battle on that. I was in Washington about a month ago to testify before the Veterans Affairs Committee about an injustice that this new bill will rectify. What they were saying is, the VA was saying that if your MOS, what your specialty was, did not include a combat label in that specialty, then you weren't available. You couldn't get PTSD. Two classic examples I brought with me. One was a Marine who went over, and he had been trained as a cook. So he got overseas and reported to his CO, and his CO says, "We're very glad to have you, but of course you can't practice your specialty here. This is in Vietnam, because we don't have a mess hall." So we eat sea rations. So they handed him a weapon and set him on patrol, and he was in combat. And he came back, and when he came back, he went to work for the police force. And he ended up retiring about 2 years ago as a lieutenant on in the narcotics division. And so when he came in to see us, they were denying him that he had ever been in combat. And this guy obviously had PTSD. The symptoms to us are just like the palm of my hands. We know after all these years. And so he had been turned out. The second guy was in the Seabees, and he was building barracks in Vietnam, and they were attacking every other night. And he had to take a rifle and go out and fight back. But he was a Seabee, he was a carpenter. So this bill has been introduced by my Congressman John Hall and Charles Schuster.